Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity. Today we have Karina Klever from Klever Compliance joining us. Karina, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. So I've been in IT 35 years now, started in April 1989 as a computer operator and became an AS400 programmer, and then got into project and program management. And about 20 years ago in 2002, got an entire bank ready for Sarbanes-Oxley by standing up an IT audit program office. And I've been in GRC ever since, over 20 years now.
Wow. I know we spoke a little bit before the show, but tell us a little bit about your story as to your journey along GRC and get into how you thought about helping folks with GRC in using recipes and cooking and other analogies like that.
So, right. So look, GRC and compliance as a whole really is not as complicated as we've all made it out to be, right? So we want to figure out a way how to make compliance approachable, because for the people who are using kind of like a checklist exercise to just be compliant, they're actually missing things that are actually applicable to their own company and their level of maturity and their industry and their things that their company does, right? So I think I use several analogies pretty frequently. The first one is if you have 12 things on your recipe list and you end up going to the grocery store and buying one of every single thing at the grocery store, like one of every fruit, one of every vegetable, one of every box, one of every type of chips, one of every candy, one of every type of meat, one of every cheese, one of every dairy. You go and you bring one of every single thing back to your house from the store. Like, you would never do that. But what we do a lot in our compliance programs right now is we have 12 things on our recipe list for tonight's dinner. We go get the entire one of each from the entire grocery store, bring it home. And then we go pull out the 12 things we need for our recipe. Like, we would never do that. But the problem is we do that every day in the compliance world. And a lot of us are just overcomplicating what we should be deploying with inside our own companies for our own compliance programs.
So as you think about that, how do you help companies with really dissecting what they need to start to build that recipe list?
So really, it's sure you may be a company that has to adhere to, a certain framework or a certain regulation. But I think that's one of the key things for getting into GRC, right? You want to learn the differences between a framework and a regulation, right? And then when you combine those two things that your company has to adhere to, now you appropriate what really applies to you today and what doesn't. What can you stagger for later? You're not going to, we all use the term, let's not boil the ocean. Let's not eat the elephant. The reality is that's what we try to do with our compliance programs all the time. So what you want to do is figure out, based on all of those influences, those regulations and frameworks, what do you have to apply, adhere to, and what do you have to apply to, right, within your own company? So if you can stagger and then prioritize those requirements, you'll have a much better success rate at implementing a GRC program, right? So for those getting into GRC, that I think those are one of the key things. I think the key thing is going to be influenced by, are you at a certain company that you're going to want to stay at and you want to grow at? Or do you have an interest in something in particular that you don't know what your interest is, whether your interest is in consumer privacy, which is huge. There's global consumer privacy laws. And in the states, we have 5 states now. Oh, July 1, we have 2 additional states coming on for consumer privacy. Maybe you like medical stuff, right? That's HIPAA. Maybe you like bank stuff. That's GLBA and FFIEC, right? So depending on what you like or where you're at today, you need to isolate which combination of frameworks and regulations do I want to make myself familiarized with, so I can start talking that language and kind of figuring out where are those overlaps, because there's overlaps all day long with all of these regulations and frameworks.
And for students or professionals that are trying to better understand like how to interpret where all those overlaps are so that they could try to pull in the ingredients list and make the best recommendations. How do you suggest that they go about it and kind of get their feet under themselves to make those best recommendations that are optimal for an organization?
So, I think that, so I always use another analogy. I'm going to use another analogy. So if you have a cookie recipe, you pull up the ingredients, and let's say you were to take the ingredients and you were to completely only look at the ingredients list. You would not pay attention to how much of that ingredient to put into the recipe. Like, this would never happen, but we do this all the time in GRC, right? So instead of 1 egg, which the recipe calls for, you'll put in all dozen eggs. Instead of a 1/4 cup butter, you'll put in an entire pound of butter, because that's all the butter you have, right? Instead of a cup of flour, you'd put in the entire bag of flour. And let's say you just completely ignore that appropriation of how much of this ingredient do you want to put into the mixing bowl. So when you throw in the entirety of the ingredient, you get this big fat mess. You're not making a cookie, you're just cleaning up, right? So what ends up happening today is when we throw in all of the ingredients in that big mixing bowl, which is what happens in most GRC programs today, we have to scale that back now and say, wait a minute, how much of this ingredient do I really need in my recipe? And a lot of things will influence that, right? What is your industry? What is your maturity? What does your risk posture look like? Do you have to abide by any regulations? There are companies who are not publicly traded, no Sarbanes-Oxley. They have no consumer privacy data. They have no personal health information. There are people who literally will just not have anything that they have to adhere to, which means that they have to scope out their level of maturity appropriately. Maybe they want to go get an ISO certification or a SOC 2 audit done, right? So based on all of those drivers and requirements and level of maturity, that's kind of how you gauge what regulation and framework do you really want to be supportive of. And there's a lot more, right? For folks wanting to get into GRC, there's learning about regulations and frameworks, potentially aligning it to the company that they're at. But then there's also doing a review of documents. Well, we've been seeing a trend. It's a little concerning. People are using templatized words like the word occasionally or periodically or once in a while or frequently or infrequently. These are not auditable words, right? If you're using a template to create your policy statements, that is not something that an auditor can come in and say, well, occasionally to you is once a month. Occasionally to me is once a week, or maybe it's once a year. So that subjectivity is very, very dangerous in the fact that it needs to be pulled out of our documentation stack. So as you're thinking about getting into GRC, look at what other folks are doing. Look at what the other groups are doing and how they're supporting the compliance efforts across your company. And then start kind of asking them questions or maybe volunteering to help them. Can I gather evidence for you from my group? Can we automate this and put it into a ticket once a week, once a month? We'll gather that evidence for you so that it's already available in support of that, compliance initiative at the company. You have storage requirements, you have risk management. Are you holding a risk registry? Offer to manage the risk registry. If you don't have a risk management program, start with a risk registry and say, okay, our controls are written in a way that we know if they fail or succeed. That's just very clear language. Who's doing it? How often are you doing it? Do not use nebulous words. And specifically, what is that evidence going to look like? And if if that control hasn't been fulfilled, if that control hasn't happened, that line item hits the risk registry. Okay, now let's build a project plan around that risk registry and say, here's how we're mitigating our own risk. Auditor comes in, you show them that you've self-acknowledged risk areas and you're fixing them. All they do is hug you, right? Because most people cannot get to that point in their compliance program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as for professionals thinking about like helping to explain that story best, I know you're creating an internship program with some of your collaborators, but what are some of the other ways that um, the next generation can kind of pick up and follow our torch into GRC and learn more about it?
So I would say pick a topic. There's one of 10 areas involved in the entire workflow of GRC. Please remember, it's not as complicated as it's made out to be. Just it isn't. I mean, it's not as prescriptive as it's made out to be. It's not as rigid. It's not a checkbox exercise. If you're treating it like a checkbox exercise, you're going to leave a lot of vulnerabilities open. Your compliance program needs to really be aligned to your company. Now, there's 10 areas. What are the 10 areas? We'll go through them really quickly. Area number 1, know the influences. The influence is the regulation or framework that influences your company. You are not to follow it verbatim. No one should, because there's going to be stuff in there that does not apply to you. You need to know what those are, right? You need to kind of learn about that if you're going to come into that entry point. There's going to be company documents. That's the second piece. This company documents need to really be reflective of what you're doing. Policy, okay. Process, okay. Standard, okay. Procedure, great. Template, okay. I don't care what you call it. What you need to figure out is how are you getting that messaging out to the folks who do the work, and how are you controlling your environment with these auditable controls that are really realistic and applicable to your daily operations, right? That goes into your third point, which is the functional controls that actually influence your functional groups. People, process, technology, right? If we're talking about IT, we can have groups and departments of people. Some companies have entire skyscraper buildings for one department, like legal or HR or whoever else, right? So you have groups of humans, you have vendors that you've hired, you have vendors might be performing some sort of a service, or you have licenses that you're hiring. So this conversation with the vendor needs to be, one of the things I always tell folks is go open up a vendor management program. Because we right now are A, data hoarding, and B, taking a lot of our data and giving it to our vendors. And we are not asking our vendors well enough whether what they're doing with our data, how they're storing it, transporting it, or processes, your NIST basics, right? So we need to create these very strong governance programs for our vendor management, because now holding those guys accountable for what they're doing with your data. This might include contract negotiation. This might include creating a vendor program. This might include RFP requirements that might be changed, or questionnaire requirements. This might be managing an active vendor. Some people will sign contracts that say, hey, dear vendor, you're going to give me a QBR once a week, or once a month, rather, once a quarter, sorry, QBR. But there's no follow through. There will be years that'll go by without any actual receipt of a QBR. So now you can go into actually creating those competency areas, right? Like a vendor management program that fulfill those stated controls at a certain amount of time. So that gathering evidence is kind of your number 4 and 5. You can inject yourself there at your company and say, can I help you gather evidence for my group specifically? Let's take a look at the controls that are written and how often you need these. If they're written correctly, again, that pass-fail criteria can move over into a risk management registry, or can just go to simple evidence gathering. As long as it's well structured, no auditor wants to come in and be given this mass folder of just random stuff that they have to wait for, right? And then there's also the audit. The audit itself, some people are scared of the word audit. Some people are scared of the word regulation. Some people are intimidated. I'm not sure why. Now, you shouldn't babble when you're sitting in front of an auditor, but you should definitely be comfortable with either being a liaison or keeping the scope tight for an audit, or the timing tight for an audit, or gathering the evidence necessary to support that audit. Or coaching, even coaching folks. Some technologists should never be in front of an auditor because they talk too much. Is just the true reality, right? They like talking about the cool stuff they're doing, and they're doing really cool stuff, but maybe they should be told they shouldn't be that verbose with the auditor, right? And then the last piece is really continual improvement, right? So once you get this cycle down, you're only getting better and better and better at it. And you start noticing what's not working and what do we change. And some people have a really tough time with decision for that initial documentation stack that the company documents. And I always tell them, you know what, let's make a decision. Let's document it now. Let's go change it in a year if it's not working. It's not the end of the world, right? Make it fluid and work for you.
Okay, I like that. And in regards to like certifications or education, are there any programs that you would recommend folks start out with that they use for continuous education, keeping up with everything?
So yes and no, right? So we do have a separate session. I don't know if Garrett's on the phone with you. We're doing a CGIT study group. This is for folks who are a little bit more senior at this point for the governance of IT, right? We've got 5 sessions happening there, and they've been really, really useful. If you are within an industry and in a company, you should get yourself really well familiarized with those regulations and frameworks, right? I think that's always the starting point. So if you're working in healthcare, go read HIPAA. Nobody wants to read anymore. I'm not sure why, right? I sit and I'll read laws and regulations and frameworks. Only with reading can you really start absorbing a lot of the content and a lot of the requirements that are stated there. And what you're going to do is start thinking about, well, wait a minute, this requirement for change management is over here, but it's also over here, and it's also over here, and it's also over there. Wow. These are all things that influence me because I have to have change management. So how do I, and this is where, that creativity comes in. How do I take one change management policy? And you can do this, right? You take one change management policy with the correct controls. You, at the very bottom of that policy, list down which regulations and requirements that one change management policy is satisfying. And now you've actually met all of those requirements, but you can't get there until you've read through the regulations and frameworks. Now, there are very few GRC classes that I know of. I don't really, some GRC is offered like as part of computer science I've heard of, right? So specifically GRC classes. There's a C risk. ISACA has a lot of great certifications. ISC squared has a lot of great certifications. And I think and even if you're technical right now, and I've got to say this, if you're technical, it is so possible to make that leap into compliance, because being in a technical role, you are already performing functions that are probably a requirement in one of those regulations and frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
So what you need to figure out how to do is, how do you take that thing that you're doing for your technical job execution and creating evidence out of that to satisfy your GRC program. It's not that much of a stretch, because the auditor might come and ask you for it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want to do is figure out, how do you ready it and prepare it for display and consumption by the auditor before you ask for it. Get into a cadence, pull a report once a month, once a week, right? And make sure that that document has that control reflected in it, that published document. So I think start internally first. And yes, Klever Compliance, we do have an internship program. We actually have quite a few people. We have sessions twice a week now, Tuesdays and Fridays at lunch Pacific, where we go through all kinds of things. We have our team members volunteer topics, and if you are interested in this, please go ahead and give me a call, and we will I can give you more details on that.
Yeah, I'm sharing the link from Garrett for the live sessions that you mentioned. And we had a great question from Shayla. If you're just going down your GRC journey or revamping it, is it best to focus on process first and then select a tool to support the process, or select a tool that best supports best practice and good process and adopt that process?
So great question. Thank you. So it is best to always have your process defined first, because the tools only are as good or as bad as the decisions that get put into it, right? So if you haven't defined your process, there's now 53 GRC tools that have been evaluated by Gartner, and there's a lot of options out there, but they're only going to be as good or as bad as the controls that you put in them. So if you have not defined your controls appropriated them to your company specifically, you're just going to get a lot of garbage in, garbage out, right? So what you want to do is make sure to define that process first, and do the human manual decisioning work of actually appropriating the controls that relate to you, and then go put them in a tool. Absolutely.
I love it. I love it. So we have about 5 minutes before we raffle off some amazing tickets for the DAN initiative in Las Vegas. So if anyone's interested, Paul's going to be coming on the line, and comment in the comments with hashtag TDI Vegas, and we'll select the folks to go in the raffle for that. But in the meantime, any final advice that you would give for individuals going down the GRC journey, or working with you in the future?
The final advice I would give is, don't let it scare you. It's not as intimidating as it's made out to be, or overwhelming. It's just a construction of a bunch of different pieces, and if you understand the pieces, it's really not that scary. And that's, I think, what I want to make sure people are not self-intimidating themselves out of this profession, because the only way we can kind of change some of the overwhelming kind of approach that people have to GRC is really just learn about it and figure out a way how to approach it a little bit easier and better, and not as complex. And I actually want to do a completely non-GRC plug, especially with the AI, if you'll allow me for a moment.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Please, as much as possible, for the folks on the line, please refrain posting pictures and videos of kids online. You are creating a digital identity for them that they might not want, right? So you ought to really allow them to do that for themselves when they become older. So if you can, please refrain with the age of deepfakes and AIs. That's just my only non-GRC plug for the day, and I give that message whenever I can.
Wow, yeah, that's so true. Thank you for mentioning that. And so here on the line, also we're joined by Paul, who has a long career in in the military, doing both GRC as well as IT. Paul, what are some of the struggles that you have found for military veterans transitioning out of the military and looking to join GRC that on she could help answer?
Oh, wow. I think the most common theme across every veteran organization you come across,
Maybe
a lot of
Paul's gonna.
crosses there, is, during the transition class that we get to exit the military, we're told we have to start over from scratch, right? And it's not necessarily that everybody's told that wrongly, as much as the people that come out and teach don't understand what everybody's level is, because they have to come out and give a general presentation. So if you've done tech, or if you've worked in a tech adjacent role.
Did we catch all of that?
What was that?
I don't know if it was me. It was coming through a little bit bumpy.
Oh, no.
So let me address that really, really quickly. So for anybody who's technical, that has access to anything technical, put a little pivot on how you're working with the platform that you're dealing with on a daily basis, and try to think, how can I gather evidence for this in support of a compliance program? Go read that regulation, go read that framework, and say, okay, look, I'm a change manager. How does that help my change management program? Okay, great. I do vulnerability testing all day. Doesn't matter what platform you're using. How are you able to take that and actually satisfy those vulnerability requirements? You do IAM all day. It's part of our daily operations, role-based permissions, least privilege access control, segregation of duties, right? How are you controlling that data, and how is that mapping up to your data classification policy? Who's accessing it? You do penetration testing, fantastic. Penetration testing is inside every single pretty much regulation and framework that's out there. So all of these, even technical rules, become really, really important for that overall governance program. And my recommendation is almost to backfill it, right? Say, here's my function. Here's what I do. Here's the platform that I use. Here's the evidence that I can collect. Let me make that into its own document of something that I'm already doing, and then backfill into the overall governance program from there.
And that's good. You're covering both. You're covering multiple bases at the same time doing that. As you're learning these GRC compliance checklists or control line items, you're also learning what these different roles are doing.
Exactly.
So kind of insider, trading knowledge of, man, do I really want to be a pen tester? They do a lot of crap I don't want to do. Report writing, I don't want to do that.
Well, and I mean, and maybe it's easy evidence gathering, right? Maybe it's using the latest tool that is really amazing, and you learned it and you got a certificate in it. Fantastic. Now, how do you optimize that and leverage that output to satisfy that compliance program? Because you're just making it easier for everybody else downstream.
What are some roles that you could think of that are traditional business function roles? I'll give one as an example, like financial analyst. But what are other roles that you feel that are just once you flip the jargon from generic to technical, you're already doing it?
A lot of analysts, and analysts is so broad, right? A lot of technical specialists, a lot of when you're actually a pen tester, when you're actually a, scanner, vulnerability scanning person, there's just, you're a change manager, you're an incident manager. For God's sakes, you work the help desk, right? Incident management is part, again, it's in every regulation and in every framework out there. How are you handling your incidents, right? So, I mean, you can take something that's already happening, and even if you're a level 1, 2, or 3, you can actually create collateral to satisfy a lot of those requirements. Make sure that they're written the right way.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for addressing those. We're going to be collecting the folks that type in hashtag TDI Vegas from all of our platforms that we're streaming to, and we're going to work with Paul to make an announcement coming up in the next couple of days of the winners. So we want to thank everyone. Paul and I both support a 5013C called the Whole Cyber Human Initiative, where we help folks transition into tech and cyber. And GRC is just one of those many verticals. So we wanted to thank Karina for coming on, Klever Compliance for sharing her availability, and everyone that's looking for a service provider, reach out to Klever Compliance. They can help you out with your GRC needs. And Karina, thank you for all that you do for the community. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for the bandwidth here in the audience. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks all. Thanks for coming today.
Take care. Bye, guys.
Bye.